Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 10th episode of Open Source in Business. This is a podcast and speaker series that we started this fall to talk about some more esoteric items connected to open source in business. And we've covered things like how to get a job in open source and bootstrapping a self-funded company, and the decision whether or not to start a company around a successful open source project. And today we've got, I think, a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about open source hardware, or open hardware in general, and some of the business models and dynamics around open hardware companies and how they make money. So I'm joined today by, I can see you on my screen. I'm going to go clockwise from the top. Limor Fried, the CEO of Adafruit, Alicia Gibb, the Executive Director of the Open Source Hardware Association, also known as OSHWA, and Jason Kridner, co-founder of the BeagleBone and BeagleBoard project, and formerly of Texas Instruments, but now working full-time on
Beagle. All Beagle all the time.
So let me get started with open hardware has been around since, like, I became aware of this community and this move to having open interfaces, open definitions of hardware, and open source drivers for boards about 10 years ago, maybe 12. Jason and Alicia, you would know better than me, but how have you seen this market evolve over the last decade? Like, did it start with a specific audience, and is it now a completely different audience? Alicia, do you want to give us kind of the overview? I know that you've done a weather report on how this market has evolved recently.
Yeah, so OSHWA just came out with a weather report, and we also did a surveying the community. We had surveyed it previously in 2012 and 2013, and so we decided that it's been almost 10 years since the survey, and it's been 10 years since the community kind of gathered around this communal definition of open source hardware. And so it definitely started very much in kind of the electronics movement, hobbyist electronics, that kind of thing. But we have really seen it take off into all kinds of different industries and fields, everything from small businesses to large companies to government entities are using open source hardware. So it's grown a lot, and we're on the trajectory to grow even more.
I saw a blog post, I think, from OSHWA recently that said that in 2007, 2008, there were about one company per year that was starting around open hardware, and that exploded, and it was now multiple companies, potentially, one a month, like 10 or 20 per year that you were becoming aware of. So how is, where has that growth come from? Is it an increase in demand, or is it a diversity of use cases that open hardware is coming from? Is it the IoT market? What's driving that growth?
I think it's really a diversity of use cases, and I think it's really having people see that the open source hardware business model works and that's viable. And so if that's how they want to deal with their IP, rather than paying for and getting a patent or some other way of protecting their IP, they choose to go open source and to give it away. I think for certain founders that want their companies to grow beyond them and to be bigger than they are, I think it's a really nice way to sort of have that, have that as part of your business plan. And not to mention, I think there's a great community that comes along with open source hardware, and there's also just the fact that it's financially viable, right? So you might just choose to do open source hardware because it makes money.
And okay. Yeah, I completely agree with the idea that you want to do things that last beyond yourself. And you talk about things that have kind of changed. The tools for being able to do open source hardware have evolved a lot in the last 10 years, thanks in some part to efforts from organizations like CERN and the KCAD software package now, where there's really a nice open source software package for designing at the circuit board level. We're seeing a lot of inroads into FPGA, open source FPGA tools. Not that most of those are often they're free anyway, but free is not the same as open source. Just because you don't pay for it doesn't mean that the information or the rights to it are preserved. So we're seeing a lot more stuff kind of evolve that way, and even governments are taking notice. Last year, I spoke at a European Commission on open source, where they're thinking about open source hardware. You see, the space agencies using open hardware in their designs, and people are getting out of school, being more familiar with building hardware, as learning it as a side hobby, and then getting out of school and doing hardware as a career, and using open source tools as the palette that they paint with, right? So that's something I've seen over 10 years, students that were in universities using Beagles and getting out and actually making, cheeseburger robots or Mars rover prototypes and stuff. So it's definitely grown.
Nice. So Alicia mentioned the open source hardware business model. One of the things I've noticed is there's definitely more than one, right? You've got Limor, can you talk about a little bit about the Adafruit business model or business models, and kind of how your company has grown its revenue over the last, I don't know how long Adafruit's been around, about a decade?
15 years.
Wow.
We started in 2005. So yeah, we release all of our hardware designs under an open source license. So everything's under like a Creative Commons share alike, which basically just, tells people our expectations for what they're going to do when they use it. And, we sell everything from like little like breakouts to like, full kits and projects. We also have a subscription box where we send you like our latest new design and some cool add-ons once a quarter, and people really like that because they're at home, and if you're going to be at home, you might as well learn something new, like electronics. But everything is published. I even looked it up today. We have like 1,400 GitHub repos, so that's a lot. So I get a lot of pull requests, and
those are those like software projects or hardware projects? Do you not make a distinction?
We don't make a distinction, even though technically, like the hardware ones, even though they're under an open source license, like the protection of them it's not been challenged in court. The software is under like well-established open source licenses, like MIT or BSD, or in some cases GPL or LGPL, depending on if we are based it off of something else, and then we have to maintain that license. But we kind of try to stick to MIT or BSD license for our software, and then we sell those projects that are documented on GitHub. We'll sell the development boards on the Adafruit site, and we'll sell them through distributors. We also have an IoT service that people can use because it's really common. People, lately there's been a lot more wireless devices, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, LoRa, and all that. Folks want to have a way to connect their devices to their computer and like send data back and forth. So I think like there's a lot of different like parts of the open hardware business model, but for me, it's still, it's funny because people say it makes open source software business model makes tons of sense. Like Red Hat is, like publicly held, owned by IBM or something now. But to me, open hardware makes more sense because I'm like physically like shipping you a thing. Like you get this thing in the mail and like you pay me money for it. And yes, you could build this yourself, but it's sort of like, cooking at home or going to a restaurant. It's like, yeah, I could cook anything technically that I could get in a restaurant,
right?
But like, it's a lot of work. You need a lot of equipment, and it takes time. And they're just like better and faster at it. And I can like drink while they make the food, so I can like have a drink and then a steak, right? So that you think that there's quite a bit of logic to the market of open source hardware,
right?
In my opinion, compared to open source software, although technically we do both.
I agree with you. And
I love that restaurant analogy. I love the restaurant analogy.
Yeah, I
now I'm thinking about cheeseburger robots, and I'm just like, I don't even know what that is, but I want one.
It's the same reason I pay a plumber, right? Yes, I could do the plumbing, but I don't have the tools. And you can print integrated circuits, and so is it in some sense manufacturing as a service? Is that kind of what the open hardware model is? That you've got an open design, and you're like, I can create this for you and send it to you, and you can pay me a fair market price.
For me, but I don't do design. I don't do design by contract. There are companies that do contract manufacturing. That's not my bag. It's a different market. Because that's more just like you have to deal with the customer and like go back and forth and figure out what they want. For us, basically, we take suggestions from the community. We get lots of suggestions. Like every day, people say, I want a breakout that does this. I want a dev board that does that. Can you combine these two things into one thing and sell it to me? Right. So I do take suggestions from the community, and I, of course, take contributions to our open source hardware. But in the end, the products that we decide to make are ones that I decide to make. And like hopefully
much like open source software, there's kind of an infinite variety of levels that you can get involved in. In the end, I think because you ultimately are making hardware or paying somebody to make hardware and then turning around and selling it to someone, people understand what they're buying if they're going to buy it from you. So I think in some ways it's a lot easier to make money if you're making hardware, but you can get involved doing things as simple as documentation. You can contribute ideas like to Limor and Adafruit. You can go, now there's all these crowdfunding places. You can you may never have to pick up a soldering iron to be in the open hardware business, right? So you can purely work in the digital domain.
But it's useful to know how to use a soldering iron?
It's always useful to know how to use a soldering iron.
Okay.
I know it a little bit.
Well, it's like you can do open source software without a compiler, but it's kind of handy if you know how to compile stuff. Like, you might have to compile stuff at some point, even if you can get away with not for quite a while.
And knowing some assembly language, even if you never write in it and you understand calling conventions, is also really important if you're an everyday compiler user.
Right. Yeah, I had a college friend who told me that his advice was always to learn a little bit about the one level below what you want to work in, because it will, like, if you know how memory layout works, you're going to be a better C programmer because you're not going to be hitting page breaks or whatever and causing slow memory lookup times or things like that. That's really good advice.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about thinking about open source hardware business models is that, and I know this is always a really disappointing answer, but I don't really think they vary that much from just selling any hardware. And I think that's because of why consumers buy stuff. So every time I give a talk, I always love to ask the question, who purchases items based on how many patents they have? And I have never had had anybody in my talks raise their hand to that, because when you think about why customers purchase things, they're purchasing things because of a particular cost, because of particular features, because they can be shipped overnight, or whatever, or like their tech support is open when you're awake, or there's all kinds of different reasons why people buy stuff. But the intellectual property attached to a product generally is not the reason that people buy stuff. So people aren't out there like making sure that something has 17 patents before they buy it. I don't know that the reverse would necessarily be true. I think there's some people who are interested specifically in buying open source hardware because it aligns with their values. And I think that's really interesting, and kind of gives open source hardware a leg up over, products that might be patented. But yeah, because people don't really buy things because of their patents, open source hardware isn't really competing in that kind of an IP market where, where closed source is. Like, we're kind of competing in the same sort of market for hardware. And I think, just to give you an idea of the breadth of industries that are out there, we have an open source hardware hammock that's certified. So how to make your own hammock. And I kind of mentioned that because you think about all the various industries, and you think about like what you need in the electronics industry and soldering irons and whatever, and it's great to know how to solder, but it's also really great to know how to sew, and it's also really great to know how to cook and to know how to do all these things. And I think that as we kind of see society swing back of this pendulum that we're kind of always on, of like, oh, we're a consumer culture, and oh wait, we want to be a maker culture, and then we're a consumer culture again, and we want to be a maker culture. I think what open source hardware does is give people sort of the tools to learn how to do all that stuff. And the open source hardware businesses that are out there are the people providing those tools that people get hungry for.
Okay.
I think there's a lot more interesting ways to try to protect your intellectual property and the things that you're doing differently than to try to hide the design files, right? That's probably not how most people are differentiating. Like intellectual property, of course, you've got copyright, you've got trademark, and you've got patents, and all that stuff is may or may not be useful depending on what you're trying to do, because there's always going to be other people out there doing interesting things, but probably nobody doing exactly what you're trying to do. And I think that your brand matters a whole lot, and that like for Beagleboard, it's all about our trademark, right? That's the valuable part. Adafruit produces a certain experience for people that go and shop on adafruit.com, and she doesn't just sell her product; she sells a lot of people's products. But they get an experience when they go to adafruit.com that they're going to be able to go and solve certain problems, or go and achieve certain things, learn certain things, build certain things. And I think that that's probably the more valuable thing to protect than what the design files are.
Yeah. So we have our first audience question, which is one of the questions that I was going to ask, whether the hardware, the microprocessor, is something that differentiates products in open source hardware, or whether you're kind of more focused on what you can do with it. The question we got is whether RISC-V is used in any open source hardware today.
So I believe that there are some. There's depends on how you count it, right? Because there's actually places where RISC-V is put into OpenPCB FPGAs, such as the Hackaday conference badge. So I believe there are a number of other open RISC-V microcontroller designs. There's not much yet at the single board computer level for RISC-V that's open hardware, but there's certainly going to be a lot of it. I mean, with RISC-V, you have that opportunity to get down into the actual design of the processor itself. So what RISC-V open sources is actually just the instruction set. So it doesn't necessarily give you a CPU, but there are people implementing RISC-V CPUs as open source as well. Look at Bunny Hong's precursor project. I think it's a pretty interesting one, building a mobile device that's fully trusted. Essentially, the FPGA has a fully synthesized RISC-V core in it.
There's 2 RISC-V open source hardware projects that have been certified from OSHWA as well.
Cool.
Can you mention those?
Yes, let me just look.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. It is the SparkFun Redboard Sci-Fi RISC-V and the SparkFun Thing Plus Sci-Fi RISC-V.
And so those are both microcontrollers, meaning that they don't have like the memory protection capabilities that you would need to run typical Linux. In my world, I think about Linux all the time, right? So that's like where kind of my community lives, or the Beagleboard community lives, is in Linux land.
So changing topics a little bit, is like there's the classic competitive strategy framework of how companies compete is you compete on price, compete for volume, compete on quality, high margin, lower volume, or you compete on fitness of use, right? You compete for niche markets. It seems to me, looking in from the outside, that open source hardware, beyond retail companies like Adafruit, who are very much product companies where you create a set of products and people buy them, that a lot of the open source hardware market is focused on catering to niches. Is that accurate? And if so, what types of niches are the biggest right now? Alicia, do you wanna have a go at that?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking through in my head. I mean, I feel like, there are definite niches out there, but I think there's also very broad places. Like you look at the wearables market, and a lot of the wearables market kind of was born from open source hardware, and so I think there's just a lot and the whole fashion industry is, quite frankly, born from open source hardware in a way, because clothing can't be patented or copyrighted. It can only depend on trademark in terms of its intellectual property. So I think that's an industry that's kind of really sort of taken off and, wholeheartedly with open source. And I think I don't know that it's really necessarily niche or not, but when you look at what's going on around us with the pandemic and how much makers have helped with PPE and masks, and just knowing how to sew a cloth mask, and putting out the instructions for a cloth mask, putting out the instructions for the face shield. The University of Wisconsin put out the instructions for an open source face shield, and when Ford did their search to manufacture face shields, they searched open source hardware face shields, because they didn't have to then go through all the rigmarole of getting licenses and talking to a company and figuring it out. They can just click on the design and run with it that day. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of niche markets, but I think it's also interesting to look at kind of where those broader markets are. Yeah, go ahead, Jason, you have something.
How many millions is niche? Right. If after
Right.
you've sold a few million, are you still niche? I don't know. I mean, because like BeagleBones get used in everything from satellite networks to like Dremel's laser cutters, to the OpenQPCR, which is a machine that you can actually test for coronavirus at home, like it's on surfaces,
Right.
or for like environmental testing. There's just, I don't know how niche is a computer that's focused on embedded systems applications, right? It doesn't, right?
Well, I guess that's an interesting question then, is whether you see the BeagleBone as an end product or part of a supply chain for the products, like all of the things that you were mentioning.
I mean, yes and yes. I mean, it's an evolving product, right? That's like takes feedback from the community, gets improved. There's a lot of different clones out there, so people make them in various different ways. So yes, it's an end product. Yes, it's a community. Yeah, all of the above.
Limor, how does your company's audience, your company's customer base, kind of break down in terms of types of audience between hacker, maker, prototyping for products? If that's part of it, the education market. How do you have any information on that, or kind of anecdotal evidence?
Yeah, I mean, we have everything from young kids who are learning at home now, and they want to make science projects, and so they'll pick up a Circuit Playground or some other $20 microcontroller board, so they can learn electronics, and they can use that with any of our tutorials. We have electrical engineers who are doing their graduate student work and their research. We also have researchers in company. Yeah, see, there you go. Even Jason's got them.
They're awesome.
They're fun.
I love them.
We've got, it's funny. It's like, remember like the Volkswagen, Volkswagen Gate, which is like they had the diesel engine was being used, but it was like they were lying about the efficiency of it, basically. So the people who did that, they were using Adafruit sensors, right? So it's like we didn't design the sensor for that use case, but they're like, okay, we have to measure the particulate output from this car. What should we use? Oh, Adafruit is documented. There's example code. We can get to the thing that we want to do without having to muck around. You can get off the shelf sensor data acquisition systems, but they're thousands of dollars. And maybe these people are like, no, we want to be able to hack them and modify them and customize them for our own use. We just saw that the ILM team that does the Mandalorian, they used some of our NeoPixel rings in the model making of like the Razor Crest, the spaceship in this show. Did we design the NeoPixel rings for use by ILM to make models? No, we designed it because we went to this goth club and this cool like goggle project we saw. We're like, we should make that, but like with like RGB LEDs. And so we made this product because I personally wanted this like weird cosplay project, but then it got used for other purposes because they're, this team, which is like, Disney ILM, they have all the money, right? Like nobody has more money than the team working on Baby Yoda.
Right.
Like I wish I had their budget. They could buy anything, right? They could have a custom engineer like design a custom board if they need to, but they didn't. Instead, they were like, here's some open source hardware that we can customize to make this cool flame effect on the spaceship, to make the controllers that we need to do this special effects quickly and on a smaller budget than we need to, so we can spend the rest of the money on cheeseburgers and drinks. We have companies like, SpaceX and Apple. They buy our components. What do they use it for? I don't fucking know. Like whatever they want, right? Because it's like they get to do whatever they want. They don't have to sign documentation or NDAs with me.
Right.
They buy the hardware and use it for whatever. When
What's
the
the feeling?
FDA had to do fast track ventilator work, folks used our hardware. Why? Because they had to quickly get known working hardware with microcontrollers and sensors to make ventilators. They had to do it in like less than a month. They wanted something that was well documented, well understood, and that they didn't have to worry about what if this company, I hate to say it, but they go out of business. Like I see people who do, they have hardware products that they sell them. The company goes out of business and the hardware's bricked. They can't use it anymore. There's no documentation. If you have a ventilator, you don't want your ventilator to get bricked. That's bad. It should work forever, right? It should be easy to repair. And if you're going to do an open source quick turn ventilator, that's important. So open source hardware fulfills many of these niches, but they're all kind of the same. Engineers have to get a product done to market that works, that's well documented, that doesn't kill them in the production cycle.
Okay.
There's nothing worse than an engineer making a decision to go down some technical path and then realizing a month later that they're totally screwed because the documentation isn't complete. They can't get the support they need. The company folds, whatever. With open source hardware, you don't have to worry about that, which is kind of nice, right?
Yeah.
You buy it and you have it forever. As long as the physicalness of it exists, the support and softwareness will work. And I think people who do software know the same thing. It's like, would you use a library if like you couldn't recompile it when the new macOS Big Sur comes out and like everything breaks? No, that sucks. It's better for using open source tools that you can then adapt and upgrade as technology improves. And like I have lots of software that doesn't work on Big Sur, so I know that this is an issue.
Do you feel like
that
that's the majority of your customer base now? The prototyping hardware use case that you've mentioned multiple times.
Wait, what was the beginning of the question? I didn't hear
I'm
it.
sorry. Do you feel like that's the majority of your customer base, or is the majority of your customer base in the kind of the education, kids making projects?
I think it's a lot of all. I mean, like it's prototyping, but also like again, sometimes the hardware just gets used in a final product. Like I know for a fact that there's companies that they're like, we have to buy 5,000 to 10,000 of this thing because we're going to use it basically in a product. Is it prototyping at the point of 5,000 components? I don't think so.
No. Yeah.
So but they want something that they can modularly use, and they know it works great. Could they design their own custom PCB? Sure, but that would add a lot of cost, complexity, and unknowns to their design process. I know that Particle, which also does open source hardware, they have these like little cellular boards, like these feather boards, and they were used in like every e-scooter. Like those like scooters that you can rent, and then like you leave them on the sidewalk and people trip over them. So the thing inside of them that tracks where they are, the GPS and cellular network that like logs the distance, that's all done with these open source hardware modules. Because the scooter company is like, we're not a hardware company, we're a scooter company. We just want to like embed this thing that works. So, it's like, do people use Linux because like it actually does a better job than some like non-open source operating system? Like, well, I'm running Windows, right? But I've also run Linux. You use the tool that's appropriate for your needs. There are some situations where Linux does a lot better, and it happens to be open source, and that's a pro, and sometimes that is part of the use case, but it's more important for the hardware to fulfill people's needs. And in some cases, the openness is what fulfills their needs.
So are you seeing in general in the market, are you seeing a lot of turnover in open hardware companies? Is it a difficult business to be in, or do you feel like it's one that is kind of on a larger scale sustainable?
the business prospects of a company have nothing to do on whether it does open source hardware. You can be a very, very successful company and do absolutely no open source hardware. You can do open source hardware and be successful or not. It has nothing to do with it. It's completely irrelevant. The skill of running a business and having a product and managing your company is completely separate than the skill of open sourcing the hardware under an appropriate license. They're completely independent.
Like an open source hardware company being a manufacturing company, do you see an effect on your margins based on the fact that it's an open source design and anybody else could create it, or is that kind of irrelevant, orthogonal as well?
Have you do you watch TV?
Yes.
Have you seen those Samsung commercials? Like for their phones? Do you see like Samsung phone commercials?
I don't know.
Do you ever watch those Samsung phone commercials and you're like, wow, those look a lot like Apple phones? Like, do you ever think that? No? Oh, I do. Apple's not open source. So what does it matter?
You'll get copied anyway, yeah.
Okay. I guess.
And we've never, as far as, with Oshawa kind of looking at the different businesses in the field and looking at, various businesses that might be opening or closing or whatever, we've certainly never seen a business that has closed because it's open source, right? Like there's other factors at play. That's why they close.
Oh yeah, and like everything.
Right. Any other factor, pick one. There's lots.
Yeah. Actually, I've seen closed source companies. A closed source company recently closed because they had their fabrication done overseas, and their factory was seized by the Chinese government because it happens all the time. And they're like, "Oh, our IP was actually owned by that company, so like we're screwed." And like they have to start the company all over again.
Wow.
Like weird, right? Like, but it happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one thing I'm trying to look for differences, because I agree with Limor, there's not, ability to run a business is ability to run a business. In the open hardware world, and as well as a lot of like things that are more focused on one-to-one relationships, you see people starting smaller businesses. So essentially starting on their own, starting part-time, doing things with maybe inventive business models and doing okay, right? But if the end of the day, if you want to make hardware, right, make hardware, and if it's part of your brand to make it open source, and that's part of how you build value for your brand, then make it open source, right?
I mean, the reason why I brought up the topic is because one of the frequently made points about open source software companies is that, if you're building a product on top of an open source project, the margins, the price you can command is lower because anybody can take the software and essentially at zero marginal cost make copies of it.
You go wrong business model. Don't sell the bits.
Don't sell the bits. That's one of the things that's kind of been a mantra of this series.
That's what I'm telling people. You should sell hardware that you ship to people because then you have a $1 moat.
You're not actually selling the software. You're selling something else. Yes.
But I mean, open source software companies have worked around this. There's also they've become more agile. I mean, like open source software licenses didn't expect cloud services like that. Totally screw them over, and but people are adapting. They're figuring out ways around this.
So selling software as a service, or selling an integrated stack of software, or selling services are all services in the software world. But I was curious whether there's an incidence on product margins that you can command in the market because you're building on open designs. Would there be increased competition to basically make copies of the same products? But as you say, it's kind of almost orthogonal to the business model.
I think in the weather report when we were doing the interviews, there's a couple, and just kind of from the history in open source, there's a couple interesting numbers that may or may not still apply because some of these numbers were like 10 years ago. But I remember at one of our first open hardware, one of the first open hardware summits, it was either the first one or the second one, Chris Anderson got up and talked about the open source hardware business model. And he said, it's incredibly boring. You sell your item for more than you built it for. And he threw out the number of 2.6 as being whatever your cost is, multiply that by 2.6, and you've got your price. And does that price make sense for a community that will buy your product, whatever, I don't know if that's like still what's used in the business world or not. Another interesting statistic that was out there was like generally open hardware companies have about 12 weeks until their products get copied if they're successful products. And I totally agree with Limor. If it's a successful product, it's going to get copied anyway. Last time I was in China, I bought an i9 phone before, like, there was, I don't know if there's an i9 now, but this is like years ago. And so like even Apple can't stop copies, right? And you know, and so you know that you're going to get copied, and that's totally part of being open source. And what happens within our communities is that they know that they've got this 12-week runway, and so they just make their products better, and they listen to their communities. Their communities are constantly giving them feedback, whether they want it or not, and they listen to their communities, and they make better features. They make it a different size. They make it a different color, like whatever the community wants. You can still, you know, have a viable product out there, even though it gets copied. And I think one of the things that people kind of miss sometimes about things getting copied is that it can take your product to an entirely new market that you may not have been able to tap into in the first place. So there might be somebody who copies it, who, you know, documents everything in a different language that you don't even know, and sells it to, you know, a different market in a different country that you don't have any stores in or whatever, you know. So I think there's a lot of value in things being copied. It's not inherently a bad thing. But yeah, I think it makes open source hardware more innovative, really.
Yeah. I mean, margins when you're making hardware, because I think you're trying to talk to software folks that don't have to deal with distribution. It's a lot more expensive to send atoms around the world than it is to send electrons. And therefore, you know, the number of hands that something touches is probably going to have a bigger deal with the margin than you know, the fact that it's open hardware or not. And, you know, of course, you need to compete all the time anyway. That's not the difference. But it also depends on how many you make, right? So that's always the thing with open hardware. You set up a machine, the machine does it over and over again. The less times you have to set up the machine, the less margin you'll have to charge.
Yay, robots.
Yay, robots.
So I'm changing tack again. I'm curious, Jason, when you started when you co-founded the BeagleBoard project, you were working for TI, Texas Instruments, and this was in the very early days of open hardware. And I'm curious how you convinced the company to invest your time and to invest money in that project originally. What was in it for them? Did you have to make a business case, or was it more kind of on feeling?
I did have to make a little bit of a business case. My role at the time made that case a little bit easier, but I had a mentor at TI that taught me it's always better to ask forgiveness than permission. I think if you know that what you're doing is the right thing to do for the company, and that you know that the results will bear that, and if they don't, you don't mind getting fired. Right. So I think that if you're doing the right thing, just do it. And I think that you know, I didn't start out asking for a whole lot. We actually got $25,000 in virtually none of my time to go build our first hardware prototypes. You know, since after that, as far as any money investments, we've always looked for people outside for actual hard money for time. Right. It just seemed that, you know, the more people know how to do things with what you create, the more innovative things that they can do. It's actually done very well at generating business for TI.
So what was your, in the original business case, do you remember what your argument was in favor of launching the project?
Some of it comes from the fact that at that point in time, TI was probably was the manufacturer of semiconductors for about 70% of the cell phone industry for the processors, you know, it's time to look at taking some of that technology as more of that was being insourced into companies like Apple and Samsung, as they were going to start making their own processors and designing their own processors rather than buying it from someone else. And it made sense to go and try to find new markets, right? And in my case was innovation happens on the edges, and at research institutions that individuals kind of sometimes outside of the area of focus of a large, the innovator's dilemma, if you've ever heard of it, right? But it's it's not going to necessarily happen at entrenched companies, and by increasing access to technology, you have a much greater chance of kind of catching innovators and developing new markets than to try to do so, through just handpicking, right? And so doing open hardware, doing something low cost where more people can get access was a funnel for innovation, and it helped launch BeagleBoard as a independent nonprofit now.
And do you feel like that was a good decision for TI? Do you think it's worked out well over the time?
I think it was a brilliant decision for TI, and we watched people across the industry kind of mimic the model and try to kind of redo the magic. I think the magic isn't necessarily all that obvious, but at the same time, it really, really is. It's listen to your community, engage with them, and don't necessarily don't patronize them. And I'm not saying we've done everything perfect, but we've tried to be sincere and engaging to our developer community and respectful. And I think a lot of times people they copy the style, but not necessarily the swagger.
Yeah. As Alicia said, if you're successful, you will get copied, and Limor.
Lots.
Okay, so one of the things that I've seen as an open source hardware model that's been very popular recently is crowdfunding for prototypes. Is people have an idea, they say we want to launch this device or this game or this thing. And rather than put the money up themselves, they kind of crowdfund the initial run. Is that something that you see as a long-term trend, or is that just a confluence of the growth of crowdfunding and kind of the lowering in cost and prototyping that you all have driven really with the open hardware movement?
Seem to be not only one not on mute. So there's it's certainly increased a lot of the access. I mentioned earlier about the idea that individuals getting involved, right? So the means of production, there's just more ways that you can just essentially go online, and you could become a embedded hardware guy that's never actually touched a soldering iron, although that's a skill that you probably want to have. With crowdfunding, it does give you a way to kind of reach out to an audience and kind of validate that market before you ever invest that money. And I think that does a lot to help with the open hardware movement.
Yeah, I think there's definite crossovers in the Venn diagram of the sharing economy and open source hardware and crowdfunding. It's all of it is about sharing, right? Whether it's sharing your money, sharing your intellectual property, so I think people who are drawn to those markets and platforms anyway kind of inherently understand the value of sharing.
And I'm not sure if it was on the pre-talk or if it was on this, we mentioned that now with what people do for printed circuit boards, right, where you can do aggregation of printed circuit boards and get them done, to get to avoid the economies of scale necessary to do printed circuit boards. And there's even shuttle services for semiconductors, right? So you get access to cutting edge semiconductor manufacturing at relatively low cost, accessible to universities and small companies to go and actually get some custom chips made.
What? And then the other topic that I have listed here that we haven't touched on is whether open hardware as a business model is attractive to investors, venture capitalists. What kind of return on capital have you seen this type of company give? Are they all like the companies that I've seen in this space tend to be either bigger companies who are doing open hardware as a sideline, or relatively small companies that are growing organically through sales and organic development of their market. Is this an area where VC could help? I know you meant we haven't mentioned it the whole talk so far, but something like a Raspberry Pi that scales very quickly, even though it's not open source hardware, I understand. Are there a number of companies like that are attractive to investors? Is there a business model in here that would be appropriate for VC investment?
I mean, I'm sure Limor gets knocked on her door all the time about VCs wanting to invest in Adafruit. I don't think there's any lack of VCs wanting to invest in some of these open hardware companies because they do see that they are successful. But we haven't seen a whole lot of open hardware businesses take VC. And I think part of that relies on the fact that a lot of times VCs want you to trade your intellectual property for their money. And in cases, I mean, we did have a very successful open hardware company throughout the years take VC funding, sell the company for $403 million, and then the VCs ended up closing all the stuff down. But so I think that there's thirst out there from VCs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the founders find the VCs interesting or need that money, because we can kind of make it on our own.
Yeah, and that's what I tend to see, that there seems to be a lot of interest from VCs, but those companies that have actually taken VC money have often pivoted away from open hardware, and I don't know that that's the extra cash infusion has been necessarily all that helpful for them growing their businesses. I've seen a lot more people grow it organically, somewhat more successfully than those that have tried to make the VC jump. And that's not entirely, if it depends. Like if what you're doing is very consumer facing, right? There's a lot of incubators that people have had ideas, have tested it in an open hardware world, and then they've established that there's some sort of demand. They've gone to incubators and VCs and have made successful consumer products. But like all of the moonshots, those tend to be the aberration rather than the rule.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering whether kind of some markets, the one that we've mentioned, I think maybe in the prep call, was medical hardware in general, diagnostic tools and things like that. We're breaking into that market as I'm trying to avoid using the word niche because it got such a reaction earlier, but as a kind of an entry into the market, a kind of a beachhead. One device might be fine, but if you want to break into the market, it may take that, like the medical market in general is one of those markets that has there's a lot of inertia in that market, and breaking into that market would probably take a significant investment in terms of sales and relationship building and manufacturing and all of the rest of it. So I'm wondering whether there are areas which would be potentially good places for open hardware to go, but that are not feasible without something like a VC investment.
I mean, I think even the medical market, I feel like a lot of the medical R&D funding stems on figuring out how to, lock down your IP, which is costly. It's very, very costly. So if you throw that money into R&D instead of into your legal department, what happens to the innovation of your product, right? And I think that at least a lot of what's happened around the maker market previously in the medical field, it's been things that need to be extremely personalized, like various prosthetics and things like that, where people really cared about having certain features or it fitting better on their arm or leg or whatever. So that was always a market that I think was keen to open source hardware in the medical field. And Jason mentioned the open PCR, and that was a device too where there wasn't any VC funding in it. But when you just look at the sheer cost of creating something that's open source hardware, they were able to sell it, I want to say, for like $1,000. Does anyone remember? I had a slide.
$3,000, I think.
Yeah.
And it was Kickstarter funded, right? So
yeah,
it was
right.
So the Open qPCR, right, which is I think it's the third generation of the Open PCR. So the Open qPCR,
right.
and now they have a successful company, Kai Bio, and they still maintain open hardware, mechanical open, software open, and that helps with their community. Now, could they have done greater inroads into medical with VC funding? I don't know. I don't know that that's ever been the bottleneck to their growth. I think they've they're niche. Well, I mean, it's a qPCR machine.
Right.
What's the market for qPCRs?
I think that's a good point. Is like, what's the bottleneck? Is probably the critical question to ask. So before we sign off, I want to ask you all, like, in terms of where you see the industry going, where you see the hardware market going, where you see the world going in the next 5 years, what are you most excited about as you look to the future, as we hopefully near the end of this pandemic? And I'm going to start with Limor, if I may.
Yes. Well, I think that there's definitely more people who are at home and building electronics. We're seeing more people subscribe to our AdaBox, who are deciding, hey, if I'm going to be home, I want to learn a new skill. People want to learn Python. They want to learn how to do hardware. They want to learn Python on hardware, which is great because that's what I think is cool. And I think that as people do this, they probably will start forming some micro companies. People start companies often in recessions. That's not unusual, because people are like, well, I don't have a job, or I'm not worried about my company and I want to head off on my own. I might as well do it now, right, before I run out of time. So I think that people will be doing that. I think IoT is very low cost. Sensors are pennies a piece now, which is wonderful. So we're going to see a lot more open source hardware in climate sensing, IoT, home automation. I definitely want to see more hardware get to more people. When I was a student, learning hardware required very expensive toolkits that only one person in the classroom basically got to play with, and everybody else would sort of just watch them. But I think that when it gets to the point of the low cost hardware available now, with like the microbit or the BeagleBone. I mean, like a single board computer for like $50 is a bargain compared to PC 104 boards. And I think that the flexibility and freedom, it's like you get to basically do whatever you want with this hardware. So definitely I see people, I absolutely see people starting companies and starting businesses, and I'm like, I know that you are using our hardware in it, or I see other people's open source hardware in your design, either at the prototyping stage or as integrated into their final design. And I think that's wonderful, right? I think that that's the whole point. We want to get more people using hardware, more different kind of people using hardware. I had an email today from an assistive technology group, and they said, you have this new CAN bus feather wing. CAN bus, is it niche? Not to people who have wheelchairs who need to communicate with them, right? Maybe there's no multi-million-dollar market for it, but there's still people who have these electric wheelchairs and they want to custom controllers for them, and they'll be able to do that now. So, it's all about finding the opportunity and matching it with the technology available. And that's what is, the engineer does when the engineer does a good job, is take those two needs and they figure out how to match them together and they connect them together. A lot of engineers don't invent something new, but they do a very good job of reinventing something for a new use case or an existing use case that didn't know about it.
Alicia, what are you excited about over the next few years?
Well, I'll say, at least from Asha's perspective, I think, we never intended to become a standards organization when we sort of started, because we needed like sort of an umbrella nonprofit to fund this open hardware summit we had. But we sort of grown into that market. And I think getting more statistics from the open hardware businesses out there is one of our goals, and seeing if we can start putting like real numbers to the open hardware community and open hardware economics, I think would be really interesting for us to do. In terms of where open hardware is going in general, I see a lot of, we kind of started with sort of in the electronics field, but with boards and things that were handheld, with things that were kind of human scale, right on that level of like, you can touch it, you can solder to it, you can do those things. And I think that we're going to see industries moving in both directions with that kind of bigger than human scale, things like Limor mentioned with IoT, like whole buildings and things like that, which is depending on open hardware and even open source architecture. And I think we're going to see things that are smaller than that coming into the open source hardware field, things like nanotechnology. So, again, it's a diversification of fields, but I think that's where we're going to see a lot more growth.
Jason?
Sure. I agree with both the comments. The IoT stuff is going to keep growing. If it's going to change some, right? It's always nicer to talk about it in terms of like automating homes, automating businesses, environmental sensing. But I think that we're going to see a lot more combined with AI and IoT. And but I'm hoping that at some point the idea of connecting sensors to that will just become much more trivial and and much more communal, right? So something that where we're really collaborating and thinking about who's owning our data and where that data is going. So if I could choose kind of what direction, I would hope for a little bit more literacy and a little bit more thoughts around who's owning that data, who's doing what with that data, and seeing more of that being controlled by individuals and a little less centralized, right? So I'm sort of hoping and expecting to see a little bit more of a shift to IoT into end users' hands, and I'm certainly excited about all the open source silicon that's starting to be worked on. FPGA tools being more open, instruction set architectures being more open, not just RISC-V, but Power. And seeing more people innovating, right down at the chip level, right? And so having a little bit more of a level playing field in terms of what people can create. Now, silicon manufacturing, I don't see that shifting anytime soon, but I do see a lot more democratization of the ability to create those silicon designs and also to create more open hardware.
Very cool. Well, thank you all for joining me. Thank you, Limor, Alicia, and Jason. So this is the final episode of the first season of the Open Source and Business series. We're going to be back in the spring. And in the meantime, I will be getting a video of this conversation up on YouTube later today. And I hope to see you all in the future. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye.
Thank you.
That's Hans.
Bye.